What if the true architects of royal legacy were not the Hanoverian kings who wore the crown, but the women who stood beside them silenced, sidelined, yet quietly shaping the course of history from behind palace walls? In the grand halls of British history, the spotlight has long been fixed on kings, conquerors, and the celebrated architects of empire. Yet behind every Hanoverian monarch from the stoic George I to the flamboyant William IV stood a queen consort whose story was often more compelling, more tragic, and more human than the chronicles allowed. These women, bound by duty, marriage, and circumstance, shaped the monarchy in ways history chose to overlook. Their lives were laced with scandal, intellect, resilience, heartbreak, and quiet influence, yet they remain, for the most part, shadows in the royal narrative. To remember them now is not merely to pay tribute to forgotten figures, but to rediscover a deeper, richer version of the past, one where queens did far more than wear crowns. From the early 18th century to the dawn of the Victorian Age, Britain was ruled by a succession of kings from the House of Hanover. While much attention has been given to these monarchs, George I through William IV, their wives have largely remained in the shadows of history. This work seeks to shift that focus, bringing to light the lives, challenges, and legacies of the women who shared the Hanoverian thrones, whether ceremonially or merely by marital association. These women were not simply ornamental figures in a royal tableau. They were complex individuals whose roles extended far beyond the gilded margins of statecraft and ceremonial appearances. Yet, over time, they have often been reduced to footnotes in broader narratives, remembered primarily in relation to the actions or reputations of their husbands. The aim here is not to elevate them as heroines or martyrs automatically deserving of admiration, but rather to understand them on their own terms, to explore how they lived, what choices they had, how they were perceived, and what historical processes have contributed to their neglect. When we speak of forgotten wives, we do not mean that these women have been entirely erased from the historical record. Indeed, many of them appear in paintings, letters, and royal chronicles. They have statues, tombs, and even cities or institutions named after them. However, they have been forgotten in a more nuanced sense. They have been marginalized within the telling of national history, neglected in the scholarly and popular accounts of British monarchy, and misrepresented through caricature, scandal, and gendered judgment. In many cases, they have been remembered more for their failures, real or imagined, than for their resilience, influence, or contributions. Their lives have often been reduced to their roles as wives and mothers, their personalities flattened, their legacies distorted. The scope of this inquiry is specific yet wide in its implications. It focuses on the 6 main consorts legally or ceremonially of the British monarchs from George I to William IV. These are Sophia Dorothea of Celle, wife of George I, Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, wife of Frederick, Prince of Wales and mother of George III, Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, wife of George III, Caroline of Brunswick, estranged wife of George IV, and Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, wife of William IV. Each of these women played a role, sometimes overt, often subtle, in the shaping of the monarchy, the court, and the broader cultural and political climate of their time. Their stories span over a century of profound change in Britain, encompassing the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, colonial expansion, constitutional crises, and the gradual democratization of political life. Yet, despite living through and sometimes within these transformative eras, their perspectives have rarely been centered. Why has this happened? To answer that, we must consider the nature of historical narrative itself. History, particularly political history, has traditionally been written by men and about men. The focus has been on kings, ministers, generals, and wars, on those who wielded formal power. Women, especially royal women, have often been treated as decorative or disruptive figures, objects of dynastic negotiation, sources of scandal, or tragic footnotes in tales of male greatness. This male-centric narrative not only determines who gets remembered, but how they are remembered. A queen who influenced policy behind the scenes might be dismissed as meddling. A consort who lived quietly might be labeled insignificant. Even when these women are acknowledged, it is often through a lens colored by contemporary gender expectations, whether Victorian ideals of domesticity or Enlightenment-era critiques of femininity. This distortion is compounded by the nature of the sources that have survived. Letters, diaries, and court records can tell us much, but they often reflect the perspectives of others, usually men. Women's voices, when they do appear, are frequently filtered through the commentary of husbands, courtiers, diplomats, and later historians. Some wives, like Caroline of Brunswick or Sophia Dorothea, left behind limited first-person testimony, allowing rumors and third-party judgments to fill the gaps. Others, like Queen Charlotte or Augusta, have had their legacy confined to narrow roles as moral mothers or stabilizing forces, with little attention paid to their intellectual lives, political instincts, or inner complexities. Recent decades, however, have seen a growing effort to revisit these narratives through new interpretive frameworks. Feminist historiography, in particular, has challenged the assumptions that once governed biographical writing about royal women. Rather than viewing queens solely through their relationships with kings, scholars now ask different questions. What were their interests? What influence did they exert, formally or informally? How did they navigate the limited choices available to them in a patriarchal court system? How were their identities shaped by nationality, religion, class, and personality? Such approaches do not romanticize these women or portray them as proto-feminist icons, but they do seek to restore agency, nuance, and voice. At the same time, popular culture has begun to rediscover these figures, albeit unevenly. Queen Charlotte, for example, has experienced a renaissance in public interest, helped in part by portrayals in modern television dramas that speculate on her mixed-race heritage and her influence at court. Caroline of Brunswick, once vilified or mocked, is now seen by many as a symbol of resistance against the misogyny of George IV and the political establishment. Yet these modern reinterpretations can also flatten complexity in the service of modern values or entertainment. The challenge, then, is to balance empathy with evidence, and to approach these lives neither as curiosities nor symbols, but as human stories situated within their time. This work proceeds, then, with a sense of both recovery and restraint. It does not claim to uncover hidden saints or neglected geniuses, but rather to present textured portraits of women who have been overlooked or mischaracterized by the dominant historical discourse. In doing so, it invites the reader to reconsider what it means to be forgotten in historical memory. Is it a matter of absence from the record, or misrepresentation within it? Can we ever fully recover the lived experience of women whose lives were shaped by courts, crowns, and constraints? And how might recentering their stories alter our understanding of monarchy, gender, and British history itself? By examining each of the Hanoverian consorts in turn, this study aims to provide a fuller picture not only of their individual lives but also of the evolving institution of queenship in a constitutional monarchy. It will consider how each woman navigated the expectations placed upon her as wife, mother, symbol, or scapegoat and what legacy she left behind. It will also reflect on the cultural forces that shaped their reputations in their own time and beyond. In doing so, it hopes to contribute to a broader project, the reweaving of historical narrative to include those whose lives were always present but insufficiently seen. These queens may have been consorts, but they were never merely that. They were participants in the grand theater of power, emotion, and identity that shaped a nation, and in remembering them, we remember part of ourselves. Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the wife of George I, stands as one of the most tragic and enigmatic figures among the wives of the Hanoverian kings. Her story, though scarcely emphasized in mainstream royal narratives, is one of emotional isolation, scandal, political manipulation, and ultimate erasure. More than a cautionary tale or a historical footnote, Sophia Dorothea's life raises profound questions about the treatment of royal women, the constraints of dynastic politics, and the ways history chooses to remember or forget those caught between personal will and institutional power. Born in 1666, Sophia Dorothea was the daughter of George William, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and his mistress-turned-wife Eleanor Desmere d'Albret, a French Huguenot of minor nobility. Although her parents' morganatic marriage initially cast a shadow over her status, Sophia Dorothea was raised at the Celle court with all the privileges of a noblewoman. Her position became politically valuable when dynastic considerations came to the fore in the late 17th century. The solution to several lines of succession and inheritance disputes among the various branches of the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg was to marry Sophia Dorothea to her cousin George Louis, the future George I of Great Britain. The marriage, contracted in 1682, was driven entirely by political convenience. It was meant to solidify alliances within the family and consolidate claims to territory and rank. There was no consideration of compatibility or affection. Sophia Dorothea was young, spirited, and vivacious, characteristics that clashed sharply with the dour and reserved George Louis. He lacked charisma, warmth, and imagination, and he treated his wife with cold disdain. Within the rigid confines of the Hanoverian court, their relationship quickly deteriorated. George Louis showed little interest in his wife beyond the necessary production of heirs, and he preferred the company of his long-term mistress, Melusine von der Schulenburg. Sophia Dorothea, on the other hand, felt trapped in an alien environment, surrounded by courtiers who viewed her as a political irritant rather than a future consort. Cultural and linguistic differences deepened her sense of isolation, Sophia Dorothea spoke French and had a more cosmopolitan outlook, while the Hanoverian court was provincial, militaristic and deeply patriarchal. In this stifling environment, Sophia Dorothea became increasingly unhappy. Her attempts to find emotional solace and personal agency were perceived as inappropriate and even threatening. In time, she developed a close relationship with Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish nobleman and soldier serving at the Hanoverian court. Whether their connection was romantic, platonic, or opportunistic remains debated by historians, but contemporary gossip and later interpretations would portray it as a full-fledged love affair. Their exchange of letters, some real, some possibly forged, suggests deep emotional intimacy and perhaps a shared desire to escape their respective constraints. Königsmarck had a history of romantic intrigue and may have seen in Sophia Dorothea both a partner and a path to greater influence. Whatever the nature of their relationship, it ended in sudden and violent mystery. In July 1694, Königsmarck disappeared after reportedly visiting Sophia Dorothea in secret at Leinschloss, the Hanoverian royal palace. It is widely believed that he was murdered on the orders of George Louis or his father, Ernst August, and his body disposed of, though no definitive evidence has ever surfaced. The disappearance shocked the court, and the scandal gave George Louis the excuse he needed to sever his marriage permanently. Sophia Dorothea was arrested and, after a hasty legal process, declared guilty of malicious desertion. This dubious charge effectively absolved George Louis of further marital responsibility and allowed for the annulment of their marriage. The punishment that followed was draconian, even by the harsh standards of dynastic politics. Sophia Dorothea was imprisoned in the remote castle of Alden, a moated manor in Lower Saxony, where she would spend the next 32 years, effectively the rest of her life. She was denied contact with her children, kept under constant surveillance, and forbidden from even using the title of Duchess of Hanover, let alone Queen, after George Louis ascended the British throne in 1714. Her imprisonment was not just physical but symbolic. It was a deliberate act of erasure. By locking her away, the Hanoverian court silenced a woman who had become inconvenient, embarrassing, and politically explosive. The conditions of her imprisonment were neither torturous nor cruel in the literal sense. She had attendance, books, a piano, and access to a garden, but they were profoundly dehumanizing. The psychological toll of long-term isolation, the erasure of her maternal identity, and the permanent rupture from public life amounted to a slow and silent death. Her confinement was rarely acknowledged in public by George I, and it was even more conspicuously ignored when he became King of Great Britain. Sophia Dorothea never set foot in England, never assumed the role of queen consort, and never had the chance to shape the court or the culture of her husband's reign. Behind her exile lay deeper political calculations. The Hanoverian dynasty, newly arrived on the British throne, was acutely aware of its precarious position. The Act of Settlement of 1701 had ensured a Protestant succession, bypassing numerous Catholic claimants in favor of Sophia of Hanover and her descendants. George I's claim was therefore legally valid but politically fragile. Any suggestion of scandal, instability, or internal dissent could weaken his already tenuous grasp on British loyalties. A disgraced wife, particularly one associated with rumors of infidelity and foreign intrigue, posed a danger not just to his reputation but to the legitimacy of the Hanoverian presence in Britain. Her imprisonment was, in this context, an act of political prophylaxis, a way to contain and neutralize a potential threat. The irony, of course, is that Sophia Dorothea posed no actual political danger. Once imprisoned, she had neither men nor allies to stage any kind of challenge. Her continued incarceration therefore became a matter of pride, vindictiveness, or perhaps fear of what her presence or testimony might stir in an already uncertain political climate. Over time, her identity was steadily overwritten. In official circles she was referred to only obliquely, if at all. Even her children, including her son George Augustus, the future George II, were raised to regard her with distance or disdain. The monarchy moved forward and she remained frozen in time, a relic locked behind both literal and metaphorical walls. When Sophia Dorothea died in 1726, 2 years after George I, she had been a prisoner for more than 3 decades. She was buried quietly without the honors befitting her former status. Her death occasioned little comment in the royal courts of Britain or Hanover. It was as if she had never existed, at least not in any form worthy of public mourning. And yet, even in death, her story refused to fade entirely. Whispers persisted about the injustice she suffered, the love she lost, and the brutal efficiency with which she had been silenced. Later generations would uncover her letters, speculate about Königsmarck's fate, and debate whether she had been a victim of her own romantic folly or a pawn in a cold, dynastic chess game. In historical judgment, Sophia Dorothea occupies a liminal space neither fully villainized nor wholly rehabilitated. Early British historians, writing under the influence of a Whig monarchy eager to affirm the legitimacy and morality of the Hanoverian line, either ignored her or portrayed her as morally suspect. She was described in dismissive terms: emotional, foolish, promiscuous. These interpretations echoed the misogynistic tropes of their time, reducing complex female figures to cautionary stereotypes. Her husband, George I, by contrast, was treated as the steady if uninspiring founder of a necessary Protestant dynasty. More recent scholarship has attempted to reframe Sophia Dorothea's life in a more sympathetic and humanizing light. Feminist historians have examined the gendered dimensions of her downfall, noting how little room she had to express autonomy within a rigid patriarchal structure. Others have explored the political uses of female sexuality in the early modern courts, showing how charges of infidelity or scandal were often weaponized to remove inconvenient women from power. Sophia Dorothea's case fits this pattern precisely. Her alleged transgression became the pretext for her lifelong erasure, and in that erasure lies a broader story about control, reputation, and historical silence. Ultimately, Sophia Dorothea of Celle is not simply a forgotten queen because she never held the title in Britain. She is forgotten because she was deliberately removed from both life and memory by a system that found her presence intolerable. Her voice, when it comes through letters or reconstructed testimonies, speaks not just of personal grief but of institutional injustice. She was a wife, a mother, a lover, a prisoner, and through it all, she remained a person whom history struggled to categorize. In revisiting her story, we do not just learn more about one woman's tragic fate. We also come to see the architecture of monarchy more clearly, the scaffolding of power, gender, and silence upon which royal legitimacy was built. Sophia Dorothea's life may have ended in quiet obscurity, but her story resonates still. It reminds us that the great machinery of history often leaves behind those who were inconvenient to its official narratives. Her imprisonment, both literal and historical, is not just a personal tragedy but a symbol of the cost of being a woman in a world where power could not belong to you even when you married it. Caroline of Ansbach, wife of George II, holds a unique and vital place in the history of Britain's Hanoverian queens. Unlike many royal consorts whose roles were limited by the ceremonial and dynastic expectations of their times, Caroline distinguished herself as a woman of intelligence, political acumen, cultural influence, and enduring popularity. While she did not wield formal power, her influence at court and in the shaping of early Georgian politics was both considerable and subtle, blending personal insight with philosophical sophistication. In a world dominated by men and constrained by rigid roles for women, Caroline carved out a sphere of influence that was both respected and strategically executed. Born in 1683 in Ansbach, a small principality in what is now southern Germany, Caroline was raised in a court that was unusually open to Enlightenment ideas. Her father died while she was still young, and she was brought up by her mother and later under the guardianship of Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg, who would become the first king of Prussia. This environment marked by religious tolerance, philosophical discourse, and intellectual curiosity left a lasting imprint on her. She received a broad education, unusual for women at the time, and was known for her fascination with theology, natural philosophy, and the ideas circulating among Europe's thinkers. As a young woman, she corresponded with scholars and theologians, including Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the foremost intellectuals of the era. Caroline's intellectual formation was not just a private characteristic but an essential part of her identity and future influence. Her early exposure to Protestant theology and Enlightenment rationalism helped shape her later political and cultural strategies. She was raised a Lutheran but converted to Anglicanism before her marriage, not only to meet the requirements of the British monarchy but also as a considered theological choice. Her religious sensibility was ecumenical, and she maintained a keen interest in religious debates. She saw no contradiction in being a devout believer while embracing scientific progress and philosophical inquiry, an attitude that resonated deeply with the ethos of the Enlightenment and would inform her later patronage of both religion and science in Britain. Her marriage to George Augustus, the future George II, was arranged in 1705. While it was primarily a political alliance, it quickly developed into a partnership marked by mutual respect and, at least in its early years, genuine affection. George, though not intellectually inclined himself, valued Caroline's insight and judgment. She, in turn, skillfully managed his mercurial temper and occasional political clumsiness. Their marriage survived various personal and political trials, including George's long-standing relationship with his mistress Henrietta Howard. Caroline tolerated this with a level of stoicism and strategic grace that reflects her pragmatic understanding of royal marriage and court politics. When George I died in 1727 and George II ascended the throne, Caroline became queen consort, and her role in state affairs became more pronounced. While the British Constitution prohibited her from holding any formal office or legal authority, Caroline wielded what historians often call soft power, an influence exercised through conversation, mediation, and persuasion. Her political importance was especially evident in her collaboration with Sir Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto prime minister. Although Walpole and George II had a rocky relationship at first, Caroline acted as an intermediary, smoothing tensions and ensuring communication. She respected Walpole's abilities and shared many of his pragmatic views on governance. Walpole in turn recognized Caroline's intelligence and often sought her counsel in political matters. This triangular alliance between the Queen, the King, and the minister helped stabilize the early Georgian monarchy and solidify the principles of ministerial government that would become foundational to Britain's modern political system. Caroline's influence extended beyond mere domestic persuasion. She actively participated in discussions about appointments, policy directions, and the management of court factions. Her apartments at Kensington and St. James's Palaces became informal political salons where decisions were shaped behind the scenes. She was particularly effective at managing the king's temper and resistance to change, guiding him toward decisions that were more politically viable. In this way, Caroline operated not as a shadow monarch, but as a trusted advisor with the ear of both the king and his ministers. Beyond politics, Caroline left a lasting cultural legacy through her support of the arts, education, and early science. She was an enthusiastic patron of the Royal Society and maintained an ongoing interest in the work of figures such as Isaac Newton. Her court became a haven for intellectuals, scientists, and artists. Caroline encouraged public discussion and supported various projects aimed at popularizing scientific knowledge. Her endorsement of inoculation against smallpox, for instance, helped legitimize the practice in Britain, paving the way for its eventual acceptance as a public health measure. She herself allowed her own children to be inoculated, a bold and risky decision at the time, demonstrating her commitment to rational medicine over superstition. Her support for education and theology was equally notable. Caroline corresponded with and supported a range of theologians from across the Protestant spectrum, promoting tolerance and intellectual engagement rather than dogmatic rigidity. Her sponsorship of theological debate and her deep interest in reconciling faith and reason made her a key figure in shaping the religious culture of early Georgian Britain. She viewed the monarchy not merely as a ceremonial institution but as a platform from which intellectual and moral progress could be encouraged. In terms of public image, Caroline was unusually popular for a queen consort. She combined a regal dignity with an approachable demeanor that made her beloved by many. Her patronage of the arts extended to public works and charitable foundations, and she was often seen as a model of queenly virtue, compassionate, wise, and engaged. This public perception was partly the result of conscious image management, but it also stemmed from her genuine interest in the welfare of her subjects. Unlike many other consorts, Caroline's popularity did not rely solely on her role as mother of the nation. It was also rooted in her perceived intelligence and moral character. Her personal life, however, was marked by both emotional endurance and profound physical suffering. Her marriage with George II, while politically strong, endured periods of estrangement due to his infidelity and her own occasional illnesses. Yet Caroline's handling of her husband's mistresses, particularly Henrietta Howard, reflected her sense of political necessity rather than personal weakness. By choosing to maintain cordial relations with Howard, she ensured stability within the court and avoided the destructive rivalries that had plagued earlier royal households. In this, as in many other aspects of her life, Caroline demonstrated a remarkable balance between personal dignity and political savvy. Tragically, her life was cut short by a slow and painful illness. In 1737 she suffered from what is now believed to have been a strangulated umbilical hernia, a condition that caused her excruciating pain over several months. The treatments available at the time were rudimentary and largely ineffective, and her suffering became a public drama. George II, despite his often brusque manner, was visibly distraught during her final days, reportedly declaring that he had lost not only a queen but a trusted companion. Her death provoked widespread mourning, not only in the court but among the broader public, and it marked the end of an era in which a consort had exercised extraordinary informal power. Caroline's legacy has endured, though not always with the clarity it deserves. Early historians often downplayed her political role, framing her instead as a loyal wife and moral influence on the king. Later interpretations, especially those influenced by feminist scholarship, have attempted to reassess her as a figure of substantive influence and independent thought. Unlike her predecessors or successors, Caroline left behind a body of correspondence and a set of political relationships that testify to her intellect and skill. She was not merely an accessory to her husband's reign, she was an active contributor to it. Moreover, her model of queenship set a precedent that would influence later consorts, most notably Queen Charlotte and Queen Victoria. Caroline demonstrated that a queen could be both intellectually engaged and politically relevant, even within the limitations imposed by a constitutional monarchy. Her example showed how soft power wielded through influence, conversation, and patronage could be as effective as direct authority. She did not need to challenge the king publicly or assert her independence in dramatic terms. She shaped outcomes by working within the structures available to her and doing so with rare skill. Caroline's life also offers insights into the broader dynamics of Enlightenment Europe, where the intersections of religion, science, and politics were being redefined. She belonged to that generation of European elites who believed in the possibility of progress through reason and dialogue. She supported institutions that embodied these ideals, from the Royal Society to theological academies, and she saw the monarchy as a vehicle for moral leadership. Her vision of queenship was, therefore, both rooted in tradition and aligned with the future. She held a deep respect for the dignity of the crown, but she also understood that the strength of monarchy lay in its ability to adapt to changing times. In reflecting on Caroline of Ansbach, one is struck not only by her achievements but by the ways in which she used her position to expand what was possible for a royal woman. She was, in every sense, an Enlightenment queen, thoughtful, tolerant, intellectually curious, and politically effective. Her legacy is not marked by grand military triumphs or dramatic scandals but by a quiet, consistent shaping of the institutions and ideas that defined her era. In remembering her, we remember not just the wife of a king but a woman who helped define the moral and intellectual fabric of early 18th century Britain. Her story, like that of many women in history, was long filtered through the assumptions and simplifications of male-dominated historical narratives. Yet Caroline's actions, relationships, and commitments reveal a woman whose importance extended well beyond the domestic or symbolic. She shaped politics, patronized knowledge, and exemplified a model of queenship that was both intelligent and humane. In giving her the place she deserves in our understanding of the Hanoverian dynasty, we not only do justice to her memory but also enrich our understanding of a period in which monarchy was being quietly transformed by the very figures it sought to constrain. Caroline of Ansbach, far from being a passive figure in the margins of power, was one of its most influential architects. Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, often a peripheral figure in mainstream British historiography, lived a life shaped by dynastic obligation, personal resilience, and quiet political maneuvering. As the wife of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and mother to King George III, Augusta occupied a position that was both intimate with power and curiously sidelined by the structures that defined royal life in the 18th century. Her experiences as a foreign-born princess, a widowed consort, and a matriarch in a fractious royal family reveal the quiet complexities of a woman who influenced the monarchy from the shadows but rarely received due recognition for her role. Her life was marked by isolation, determination, and strategic motherhood, yet in traditional narratives she has often been depicted through a lens of suspicion or disdain, particularly by those who viewed her influence over her son as controlling or unnatural. This assessment fails to consider the constraints she faced and the delicate balance she had to strike between maternal duty and political discretion. Born in 1719 in the German Duchy of Saxe-Gotha, Augusta was only 16 years old when she was selected to marry Frederick, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of King George II and Caroline of Ansbach. Her arrival in Britain in 1736 was met with the typical suspicion and cultural scrutiny reserved for foreign brides, especially one so young and seemingly unprepared for the complexities of British court life. Augusta spoke little English upon arrival and was thrust into a royal court that was politically divided and personally hostile. The court of George II was well established, with Queen Caroline playing an active role in both domestic and political spheres, and Augusta was expected to adapt quickly to the protocols and intrigues of her new position. However, her awkwardness in public and her difficulties with language and etiquette made her an object of criticism. Many in court saw her as lacking the sophistication and flair that had characterized her mother-in-law, Caroline, and her social missteps were exaggerated into charges of ignorance or even insolence. Her marriage to Frederick was not one of deep affection or mutual understanding. Frederick, estranged from his parents and prone to rebellion, was more interested in using Augusta as a pawn in his ongoing battles with his father than in building a meaningful marital relationship. Augusta was caught between two power centers: her husband, who sought to establish his own household and political identity in opposition to the king, and her in-laws, who viewed Frederick's independence and by extension, Augusta's loyalty to him with deep suspicion. The prince's court at Leicester House became a center of opposition politics, and Augusta, though often passive in these early years, was swept into the tensions that marked the internal fractures of the Hanoverian dynasty. Her role as mother became the most significant and enduring aspect of her public life. Augusta gave birth to 9 children, the most important of whom was the future George III, born in 1738. From the beginning she took a strong and proactive role in shaping his education, character, and religious sensibilities. Her emphasis on moral integrity, personal discipline, and Protestant piety had a lasting effect on George, and many of the traits that came to define his kingship, his frugality, strong sense of duty, and personal morality, can be traced back to Augusta's guidance. She saw in her son not just a boy to be cherished but a future king to be molded, and her decisions as a mother were inseparable from her understanding of dynastic responsibility. Augusta's life changed irrevocably with the death of Frederick in 1751. At only 32, she became a widow with a large family to raise and a precarious position at court. As Dowager Princess of Wales, she occupied a space that was both prominent and vulnerable. She no longer had the authority or protections of being the wife of the heir apparent, but her son was now directly in line for the throne, and she assumed the de facto leadership of her children's upbringing. Her household became an alternative power center, one that operated in tension with the court of George II. The king had little affection for Augusta and resented her perceived interference in matters of succession and education. Rumors circulated about her influence and supposed manipulations, and her German origins were frequently used as a tool to discredit her among a British elite increasingly sensitive to questions of national identity and loyalty. Despite the suspicion that surrounded her, Augusta managed to secure a remarkable degree of independence. She carefully supervised the education of George and his siblings, employing tutors who shared her values and shielding them from court influences she considered morally or politically dangerous. She placed particular importance on religious instruction, moral uprightness, and resistance to excess, all principles that she believed were essential to the stability of the monarchy. This austere and disciplined upbringing later led some contemporaries to criticize her as overbearing or prudish, but Augusta's intentions were rooted in a clear-eyed understanding of the fragility of dynastic legitimacy and the moral scrutiny that royal children would inevitably face. Her influence during the early years of George III's reign was substantial, though often exercised indirectly. When George ascended the throne in 1760 at the age of 22, Augusta's role shifted once again. She was no longer a widow managing a princely household. She was now the mother of the sovereign, a position that afforded her both symbolic and practical authority. Initially, George relied on his mother for advice and guidance, and many of her preferences, including her suspicion of certain court figures and her support for morally upright ministers, shaped his early decisions. She is believed to have had some influence in the appointment of John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, as the king's first prime minister. Bute, a tutor and confidant to George during his youth, was closely associated with Augusta and shared her commitment to moral reform and hierarchical stability. His appointment provoked immediate backlash, especially from political opponents who viewed Augusta's influence as dangerous and illegitimate. These suspicions were exacerbated by misogynistic and xenophobic rhetoric that sought to undermine her authority. Cartoonists and pamphleteers portrayed her as a scheming foreign woman, manipulating her son from behind the scenes. Her German origins were highlighted to imply that her influence was un-British, while her moralism was depicted as a cover for autocratic ambition. The notion of the German cabal became a recurring theme in anti-court literature, with Augusta cast as the central villain. Yet much of this was exaggerated or outright false. In reality, Augusta had little desire for public power. She preferred to operate through the private channels of family and court, aiming to protect her son and the monarchy from the political chaos that had characterized her husband's life. Over time, as George matured and grew more confident in his role, Augusta's influence receded. She accepted this transition with characteristic pragmatism, withdrawing from active political involvement while maintaining a dignified presence at court. She continued to play a role in the lives of her grandchildren, including the future George IV, and remained a respected if somewhat distant figure within the royal family. Her later years were quieter, marked by a retreat from public controversy and an increased focus on religious devotion and charitable works. She died in 1772, her legacy largely shaped by her role as mother to a king rather than by any official position or title she held. Yet in retrospect, Augusta's contributions to the monarchy were far from marginal. Her success in raising a son who would become a conscientious, if controversial, king was no small feat, especially given the instability and factionalism of the court she inhabited. She maintained her dignity and composure through personal loss, political slander, and institutional resistance, crafting a life of meaning and influence from within the limited avenues available to women of her station. Her strategic use of motherhood, moral education, and household management positioned her as a foundational figure in the transition between the early and later Hanoverian dynasties. Modern historians have begun to reassess Augusta's role, moving beyond the caricatures that dominated earlier accounts. Rather than seeing her as merely an interfering mother or a political reactionary, recent scholarship has emphasized her careful stewardship of royal legacy, her engagement with Enlightenment values through education, and her ability to navigate a hostile court environment with caution and effectiveness. Her marginalization in traditional narratives is a testament not to her insignificance but to the gendered frameworks through which power has been historically assessed. In the absence of formal authority, Augusta exercised informal power in ways that were both subtle and substantial. Ultimately, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha's story is emblematic of the broader experience of royal women during the 18th century, bound by convention, judged by double standards, and often remembered more for their proximity to male power than for their own contributions. Yet within these constraints, Augusta managed to influence the direction of the British monarchy, shaping the values of one of its longest-reigning kings and ensuring continuity in a period of potential rupture. Her legacy lies not in monuments or legislation but in the character and conduct of a son who, for all his flaws, embodied many of the ideals she cherished. Her life may have unfolded in the shadows of greater political dramas, but those shadows were often cast by her steady and guiding hand. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz was selected to marry George III when she was just 17, appearing as a shy, gentle German princess rather than a forceful political figure. That initial impression, however, quickly shifted as she adapted to her new life, and what began as a ceremonial union blossomed into a quietly devoted partnership that would endure over half a century and leave an indelible mark on British royal life. Just 6 hours after her arrival in England in 1761, she was married to the dashing young king. Thrust into a foreign court, she immediately set to work learning English and navigating the complexities of a new culture. Though her accent remained strong, observers came to appreciate not only her punctuality and discipline, but the sincerity behind her polite and increasingly fluent speech. Early accounts described her as timid but talkative among familiar company, a cautious compliment that hinted at her rapid transformation into a respected presence at court. The affection between George and Charlotte was genuine and steady. Far from being a cold political match, their relationship weathered the years with mutual respect, shared interests, and the daily rituals of court life. Unlike marriages built on convenience, this one bore warmth. George appreciated her calm counsel and gentle nature, while Charlotte cherished the security and continuity of her role. The result was a royal household that valued stability, in enormous contrast to her predecessor's often fractious reign. Charlotte's role may have been informal, but her influence was far more significant than official titles suggest. She deliberately maintained political neutrality, steering clear of partisan wrangling, yet she remained a steadying presence during periods of international upheaval. During the American Revolution, she advised her husband to temper his responses, arguing that mercy and measured restraint could avert deeper conflict. In the turbulent years of the Napoleonic Wars, she quietly worked to maintain court morale, funding charitable efforts to relieve soldiers and civilians alike. Her contributions remained unobtrusive but sincere, often reflected through shared conversations with ministers and courtiers. Through these subtle interventions, she helped shape royal attitudes toward war, duty, and public responsibility embodied not in manifestos, but in the character of the crown itself. Her impact on the royal family, particularly through motherhood, was profound. Over the course of her marriage, she bore 15 children, 13 of whom survived into adulthood. Charlotte approached parenting as a moral mission, instilling in her offspring a sense of duty, discipline, and religious devotion. Even under the pressures of a large regal household, she ensured that each child received proper instruction, a nurturing environment, and the emotional stability that undergirded her own relationship with George III. Her influence extended to her grandchildren as well, reinforcing high standards of conduct and monarchy-centered values in preparation for future generations. Her dedication was severely tested when George III began exhibiting signs of mental illness in the late 1780s. Episodes of anxiety, mania, and depression escalated over time, culminating in a prolonged decline that eventually led to his official removal from power in 1811 and the appointment of the Prince Regent. Throughout this ordeal, Charlotte remained a steadfast partner. She acted as the king's legal guardian, continued to live alongside him in royal households, and provided diplomatic care even as his condition worsened. Her strength spoke volumes. Where plenty might have abandoned or marginalized him, she remained by his side, offering dignity and constancy. Though she could not prevent his decline, she managed its public optics, keeping him suitably attired, sheltered, and shielded from emotional harm. This combined care and discretion earned her respect both at court and in the public eye, revealing her capacities not as a ceremonial consort, but as a responsible companion. In her final years, Charlotte's own health began to falter under the weight of age, grief over her husband's broken spirit. She faded from public life, yet her inner reserves continued to serve the crown, managing her household, maintaining decorum in official events, and representing the monarchy when her son, the Prince Regent, was indisposed. When she died in 1818 after 57 years of marriage, she left behind a legacy not in statutes or speeches, but in the measurable dignity with which she conducted herself and shaped the monarchy. She was buried at Windsor beside her beloved George, closing a chapter of quiet devotion that had shaped two eras. Long overshadowed, Charlotte was often defined in her own time as plain, reserved, or unremarkable. Critics like Dickens and Sir Walter Scott described her as a plain-faced queen, and some denigrated her appearance. These characterizations persisted until historians began to re-examine her life and contributions. Only in recent decades has her reputation been rehabilitated. Scholars highlight her foresight in patronizing public education, promoting the arts, expanding Kew Gardens, and championing botanical and musical undertakings. Her regular performances for visiting musicians, her introduction of the Christmas tree to Britain, and her ongoing philanthropic work revealed a compassionate queen who viewed her status as both duty and opportunity. A key chapter of Charlotte's modern reinterpretation centers on the theory that she may have had African ancestry. Genealogical and artistic analyses based on descent from a medieval Portuguese noblewoman associated with the Moors have fueled the claim that she could have been Britain's first royal of mixed descent. Alan Ramsay's portraits, some argue, suggest features beyond the typical European countenance. Even a physician of the time reportedly described her as having a true mulatto face. That said, many historians remain skeptical, pointing to the remoteness of ancestry and lack of definitive DNA evidence. What matters more than her exact ethnic origins is the way this possibility has reshaped her perception. In an era reckoning with systemic racism, Charlotte's story has been reimagined through a richer, more inclusive lens. Her image in the Netflix series Queen Charlotte, a Bridgerton story, resonated because it offered a more diverse vision of the past, a reflection of changing appetites for representation. The debate surrounding her ancestry underscores the human impulse to see oneself in history. Regardless of whether ancestry theories endure, Charlotte's reinterpretation marks a transformation in what royal history can mean for today's audiences. Taken together, Charlotte's life exemplifies the power of soft leadership through duty, dignity, and steadfast morality. She set a standard of consortship rooted in intellectual curiosity, public-mindedness, and compassionate governance. Through her marriage, she supported a reign marked by stability even amid revolution and world war. Through her care for George III, she embodied empathy and endurance. Through her cultural legacies, she enriched Britain's intellectual and civic life. And through modern reframing, she speaks to those eager to see the royal story include diverse experiences, multi-layered identities, and women's understated influence. Queen Charlotte emerges not as a peripheral footnote, but as a central pillar of her age. Hers is the story of a woman who loved deeply, served faithfully, and hoped quietly, and whose legacy beckons us toward a broader, more empathetic understanding of power in history. Caroline of Brunswick's story unfolds as a dramatic saga of a royal marriage undone, a queen rejected, and a woman who, despite her isolation and scandal, captured the nation's sympathy and reshaped what it meant to be a consort in the public eye. Her life was defined by a hostile and short-lived union, court exile filled with rumors and spectacle, a defiant return and public trial, and ultimately, a legacy colored by political upheaval and popular heroism. When Caroline arrived in England in 1795 to marry the future George IV, she entered a union that would quickly sour. Their wedding day was memorably dismal. George, reportedly drunk, spent the night under a grate rather than beside her, an omen of their doomed marriage. They had one child, Princess Charlotte, but the marriage collapsed almost immediately, leading to permanent separation. Caroline was blamed for alleged indiscretions, while George paraded mistresses, reinforcing public perception of a wife victimized by her husband's infidelity. In 1806, Caroline faced the delicate investigation, a private inquiry aimed at unearthing proof of her alleged affairs, including rumors that she had borne an illegitimate child. Though the inquiry cleared her of adultery, it fueled gossip, especially around her close relationship with Bartolomeo Pergami, a servant-turned-trusted companion during her exile in Italy. The sensational whispers of shared bedrooms and public affection made Caroline a magnet for scandal and curiosity. During her Italian exile, she embraced Pergami's company, touring the Mediterranean and living openly with him. Reports circulated of her riding a donkey in the Holy Land and living as man and wife with him. George seized these rumors to rally support for severing the marriage, but public sentiment increasingly favored the wronged princess over the rake-turned king. George III's death in 1820 made her Queen Caroline in name, but George IV, determined to humiliate or divorce her, introduced the Pains and Penalties Bill in Parliament. Framed as a bill to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve the marriage for adultery, the measure became a public trial by media and society. Parliamentary opponents and witnesses provided salacious testimony. The entire nation followed every detail. In a remarkable alignment of public sympathy and political tension, over 1 million signatures were gathered in her defense, and vast crowds rallied. The bill passed the House of Lords but stalled in the Commons, thanks to intense public and political backlash. Celebrations erupted across the country when the government dropped the bill. Church bells rang and government offices and journalists' windows were smashed in solidarity. Though uncrowned, Caroline had achieved a symbolic victory. She became not just a woman scorned, but the face of equality whose cause struck its roots into the heart of the nation. Yet this emotional victory came at cost. George made sure Caroline was barred from his coronation on 19 July 1821. Despite her persistent efforts, turning up at Westminster Abbey in regal dress and escorted by supporters, she was refused at doors, shut out by officials, and jeered by a wary crowd. Her turn from champion to outcast was evident in public reaction. Some hailed her courage, others ridiculed her audacity. Less than 3 weeks later, Caroline fell ill, likely from bowel obstruction, and died. In her will, she requested that her coffin carry the inscription "Caroline of Brunswick, the injured Queen of England." The government denied her wish, and although a silver plate was made, she was buried quietly in Brunswick. Anger boiled over during her funeral procession, which the government tried to divert away from London, yet mobs followed and clashed with authorities. 2 people even died in the unrest. Caroline's death was the finale of her fraught life, but her impact reverberated politically. The Queen Caroline affair marked a rare moment when public opinion defied royal authority and stoked reformist hope. It empowered disenfranchised crowds, ordinary men, women, and radicals to marshal petitions, hold protests, and challenge political orthodoxy within constitutional bounds. The public pushback signaled that beyond monarchs and ministers, a new actor had claimed legitimacy in modern governance: the people. In popular imagery, Caroline became a folk heroine. Plates, cartoons, and medals bearing her likeness circulated widely. Pamphlets and satires flowed both in her favor and against her, but ironically, even her critics confirmed her influence. Radical leaders like Richard Carlile found inspiration in her plight and lent support. In the royal household, judgment remained harsh. Slurs like "Bedlam bitch of a queen" and a wafer-thin inscription, "A shameless woman," reflected entrenched misogyny. Satirists savaged her appearance and behavior. Despite being ideologically portrayed as a survivor of royal cruelty, Caroline's public demeanor, her stoic battle, and sometimes indiscreet public conduct alienated some. Politically, Caroline's case helped strengthen Whig populist alliances and revealed how interconnected popular culture, reformist demands, and royal authority had become. Though the reform movement lost momentum after her death, Caroline's affair yielded long-term consequences. Parliaments now perceived crowd mobilization as both peril and power, foreshadowing future enfranchisement and public accountability. Caroline of Brunswick's story ended in mourning, upheaval, and unfulfilled promises. Yet as memory endured, she became emblematic of a part heroine, part defiant queen, overshadowed by George IV's theatrics. Yes, but immortalized as the people's queen. She redefined consortship by asserting her rights publicly, confronting institutional injustice, and forcing crowds and courts to reimagine monarchy's boundaries. Her tragic journey from a scandalized foreign princess, through exile and public trial, to symbolic martyrdom underscores how personal grievances can touch national conscience. Caroline may never have felt the crown's weight, but by demanding rightful recognition and enduring humiliation to see it, she made history. In doing so, she left behind a legacy beyond mere scandal, a powerful testament to popularity, protest, and the ongoing struggle to define power in modern Britain. Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, who became queen consort to William IV, exemplified a consort whose influence was not born of grandeur or scandal but of steady virtue, resilience, and careful devotion. Born in August 1792 in the small Thuringian Principality of Saxe-Meiningen to Duke George I and Princess Louise Eleanor, Adelaide's upbringing was modest yet dignified. When her father died in 1803, her mother became regent, and Adelaide received a well-rounded education. She learned several languages and developed interest in literature, music, and the arts, preparing her for the diplomatic and domestic demands she would later face. The death of Princess Charlotte in 1817 triggered a dynastic emergency. With no heir to George III, his sons scrambled to produce legitimate issue. Adelaide, at 25, was chosen somewhat by default. Foreign, young, pious, and unentangled in British court factions. Her marriage to William, Duke of Clarence, took place on July 11, 1818 at Kew Palace, in a joint ceremony alongside Edward and Victoria of Leiningen. Though their meeting occurred just days before, the union proved affectionate. William was initially coarse and known for his extensive relationship with actress Dorothea Jordan and fathering 10 illegitimate children. Yet under Adelaide's calm influence, he reformed. He drank less, swore less, and showed less impulsive behavior. They chose to live first in Hanover, where Adelaide willingly integrated William's illegitimate children into her household, demonstrating both compassion and stability. Adelaide's maternal experiences were tragic. She endured multiple pregnancies between 1819 and 1822, each ending in heartbreak. A premature daughter, Charlotte Augusta, died within hours. A miscarriage followed. Then their daughter Elizabeth survived only 4 months, and eventually twin sons were stillborn. Through these losses, Adelaide maintained dignity and devotion, channeling her maternal instincts into care for her stepchildren and niece Victoria. In 1827, with George III's other sons deceased or childless, William ascended to heir presumptive and became king in 1830 following George IV's death. Adelaide became queen and was crowned in 1831. While William treated the ceremony lightly, she approached it with solemnity and grace, earning praise for her dignity. As queen, Adelaide was known for her piety, modesty, and charitable works. She was reserved in her court and refused to allow ladies of questionable virtue. A generous patron to the less fortunate, she donated much of her income to philanthropy and took personal interest in model cottages for Windsor youths. Her kindness extended to Princess Victoria despite Victoria's mother's hostility, helping foster early relations between Adelaide and the girl who would become queen. Politically, Adelaide maintained a discreet conservative stance. Behind closed doors, she aligned with Tory ideals and occasionally influenced William's views, particularly during debates over succession and the landmark Reform Act of 1832, though her public reticence meant her role never sparked open controversy. Personal tragedy returned with William's death in June 1837. Adelaide, aged 45, stayed by his side for 10 days through illness and exhaustion. As Dowager Queen, she received Marlborough House and Bushey House for life, along with a €100,000 annuity from Parliament. She supported her niece, the new Queen Victoria, even standing as godmother to Victoria's first child in 1840. Adelaide spent her later years quietly, residing in Worcestershire or traveling to milder climates for health. She maintained her charitable disposition and emerged publicly only at select times, like the laying of St. John the Evangelist's church cornerstone in 1849. She died on December 2, 1849 at Bentley Priory, and was buried beside William at Windsor, per her wish for a private funeral without pomp. Beyond her charitable works, Adelaide's legacy proved lasting. The city of Adelaide in South Australia was named in her honour in 1836, cementing her presence in the British colonial world. Her influence is more subtle than political power, rooted in moral steadiness, familial compassion, and a dignified comportment during a fraught and transitional period in royal history. Adelaide's role marks the conclusion of the Hanoverian consorts. No surviving children meant Queen Victoria, daughter of William's brother Edward, would inaugurate the Victorian dynasty. As the final consort of a Hanoverian king, Adelaide represents a gentle finishing touch, the restoration of public faith in monarchy after the tempestuous reign of George IV, the introduction of moral restraint into the crown, and the bridge to a new modern era under Victoria. Her life speaks to a form of queenship defined not by influence over policy or scandalous presence, but by quiet constancy, moral example, and personal dignity. In an age when queens were often invisible or vilified, Adelaide charted a different course, one of compassion, devotion, and the understated affirmation of duty. Her story reminds us that influence can live not just in public pronouncements, but in the daily choices that sustain integrity and grace, and that the end of a dynasty can also serve as the dawning of a new one. The Hanoverian queens, though not crowned rulers themselves, occupied a delicate yet significant space within the power structures of the British monarchy. Their influence was rarely institutional, yet it could be deeply impactful, exercised through proximity, persuasion, and the interpersonal politics of marriage and court. As consorts, their positions were tethered to their husbands, yet their actions, personalities, and reputations could shape national narratives, domestic policy, and public perceptions of the crown. The queens from Sophia Dorothea of Celle to Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen illustrate the complex balancing act of queenship in an age of shifting political paradigms, emerging public scrutiny, and evolving ideas of gender and authority. Within the context of a parliamentary monarchy, the formal powers of queens were limited. They had no constitutional authority to veto legislation or direct military or state actions. But this did not mean they were powerless. Their influence often lay in the realm of the informal, what historians sometimes call soft power. Through close relationships with their husbands, correspondence with ministers, management of court life, and patronage of intellectual, religious, and philanthropic causes, these women were able to steer conversations, moderate temperaments, and shape the priorities of the monarch. Caroline of Ansbach exemplified such influence. Highly educated and intellectually engaged, she was not merely a companion to George II but a political actor in her own right. She fostered strong ties with Robert Walpole, Britain's first de facto prime minister, and helped mediate between him and the king. Through her strategic diplomacy and deep understanding of court dynamics, she influenced policy indirectly, smoothing over tensions and ensuring government stability during turbulent moments. Her rooms became informal centers of political discussion, and her skill in navigating these spaces made her one of the most politically adept of the Hanoverian queens. Similarly, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, while never queen herself, played a pivotal role as mother to George III. Widowed early and marginalized by the royal establishment, she nonetheless asserted her position through her children. By directing George III's education and instilling in him values of duty, morality, and Protestant piety, she laid the psychological and ideological groundwork for his kingship. Her influence was maternal and moral rather than institutional, but it had long-reaching consequences for the direction of the British monarchy during the late 18th century. Queen Charlotte, the wife of George III, also left a distinctive mark. Though she avoided overt political maneuvering, her role as a confidant during her husband's increasingly troubled reign gave her a type of indirect authority. Especially as his mental illness worsened, Charlotte assumed greater responsibility for court stability, family order, and ceremonial life. Her correspondence and patronage reflect a woman deeply engaged in intellectual and cultural currents, though always within the constraints of decorum and constitutional limits. Yet with this soft power came immense expectations and contradictions. The queens were expected to embody ideal womanhood, chaste, maternal, loyal, pious, while simultaneously acting as public figures under continuous scrutiny. Their personal relationships were often political currency. Marriage to a prince or king brought with it the weight of dynastic pressure, to bear children, particularly male heirs, and to serve as unifying figures for the realm. In a society still structured around patriarchal authority, a queen's failure to conform to these roles could result in harsh public censure, while her success might still be interpreted through the lens of her husband's actions. Navigating the dual roles of wife and public figure proved especially difficult during periods of scandal or political transition. Queen Caroline of Brunswick offers a particularly stark example. Her marriage to George IV was marred from the outset by mutual dislike, and their eventual separation set the stage for one of the most public and humiliating royal controversies of the 19th century. Branded immoral by the court but celebrated by a sympathetic public, Caroline embodied the tension between private behavior and public expectation. The so-called Queen Caroline affair became a national spectacle, revealing how the public could both elevate and vilify royal women depending on the political climate. The 18th and 19th centuries witnessed the growth of a more literate and engaged public, and with it, the emergence of the popular press as a force capable of shaping political debate and social attitudes. Queens could no longer exist solely behind palace walls. Their images circulated widely in newspapers, satirical prints, and public gossip. This development both empowered and imperiled them. It allowed queens like Caroline of Brunswick to gain popular support, but it also exposed them to relentless scrutiny and caricature. The public could become an unexpected ally or a harsh judge. Within this media landscape, a queen's image was a matter of careful cultivation or unfortunate distortion. Queen Charlotte's patronage of music, botany, and education helped shape her public image as a cultured and benevolent matron. Her support of hospitals and orphanages reinforced her association with domestic virtue. Yet as debates about race and empire evolved in later centuries, her legacy was revisited through new lenses, including speculation about her African ancestry. These modern reinterpretations reveal how royal images continue to evolve and how historical queenship remains subject to contemporary cultural narratives. Despite these many avenues for influence, institutional constraints always loomed large. The rise of parliamentary sovereignty during the Hanoverian period increasingly limited the monarchy's role in direct governance. Ministers were accountable to parliament, not to the king or queen, and this curtailed the extent to which a consort could impact policy through official channels. Compared to male courtiers who could hold formal office or military command, queens were usually sidelined in matters of state. They lacked voting power, legal independence from their husbands, or the ability to shape foreign or domestic policy through decree. Even when a queen had the ear of the monarch, her suggestions carried no official weight. A well-positioned duke, bishop, or secretary might command greater direct political influence than a royal wife. Queens who stepped beyond perceived boundaries risked backlash. The cultural ideal of the silent, obedient consort endured through much of the Georgian era, and any woman who challenged it was subject to suspicion. The structural asymmetry was exacerbated by gendered expectations around emotion and rationality. Women were considered more prone to sentimentality and less fit for governance. Even when queens showed intellect and political insight such as Caroline of Ansbach or Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, they had to work within a framework that doubted their capacity for reasoned authority. Their power was thus always conditional, shadowed by assumptions about their proper place and mental faculties. Nonetheless, queens found ways to maneuver. Patronage offered one such avenue. By supporting musicians, scientists, theologians, and artists, queens contributed to the cultural and intellectual life of the nation. Their selections could shape public taste and signal ideological alignment. Caroline of Ansbach's support for Newtonian science and theological debate positioned her as a key figure in Enlightenment Britain. Charlotte's involvement in botany and music likewise marked her as a conduit for continental sophistication. Motherhood was another source of symbolic and practical power. Producing heirs reinforced dynastic stability, and educating future monarchs shaped the ideological orientation of the next generation. The moral authority of motherhood could also grant queens a degree of protection from political attack, positioning them as guardians of national virtue. Yet this role also became a trap. Failure to bear children or being perceived as a poor mother could destroy a queen's credibility, as seen with Caroline of Brunswick, whose strained relationship with her daughter only intensified public and private criticisms. In comparing the experiences of these consorts to those of male courtiers and ministers, it becomes clear that queens operated in a fundamentally different register. Men advanced through titles, military service, or ministerial roles. Queens advanced, if they did at all, through moral authority, soft diplomacy, or public image. This did not mean their influence was always less, but it was always less secure. They could not count on institutional continuity. Their power depended on personal relationships, public approval, and sometimes mere survival in a hostile court. Yet these limits did not erase their impact. The Hanoverian queens, in their various roles, left enduring marks on British history and culture. Whether by shaping their children's values, steadying a monarch during illness, or acting as moral exemplars during times of national upheaval, they helped define the monarchy's human face. Their constraints were real, but so was their quiet power. Eventually, queenship during the Hanoverian period was defined by paradox. Visible yet invisible, present yet peripheral, revered yet vulnerable. These women lived at the intersection of personal duty and national symbolism. Their influence might not be measured in acts of parliament or declarations of war, but in the more subtle realm of tone, example, and interpersonal loyalty. That their stories have often been overshadowed by the reigns of their husbands only underscores how deeply gender shaped both historical narrative and institutional memory. Yet to examine their lives closely is to see how monarchy itself was sustained not just by power, but by relationships. Behind each king stood a queen who, whether through patience, resilience, compassion, or intellect, helped keep the institution functioning through centuries of political and social change. Their limitations were real, but so was their endurance, and it is through this lens that we can appreciate the power and the paradox of queenship in Hanoverian Britain. Throughout British history from the reign of George I to George IV, much of the attention has remained firmly fixed on male rulers, ministers, generals and wars. Yet beneath the surface of dynastic display lay women whose stories were shaped, dismissed, and often concealed by the lenses through which history was written. The narratives of the Hanoverian queens serve as compelling case studies in how women are systematically forgotten not by absence from historical record, but by erasure, distortion, or misrepresentation. Despite the power they wielded in shaping dynastic succession, influencing policy, patronizing culture, and modeling moral authority, these women were sidelined by historians writing under deeply patriarchal assumptions. Most early chroniclers, often men working for or alongside royal administrations, minimized the intellectual and political significance of consorts. Queens became decorative figures ideally silent and smiling, never stewards of ideas or agents of change. Where they ventured beyond those prescribed roles, they were dismissed as meddlesome, emotional, unstable, or dangerously ambitious, all tropes rooted in gender bias. It was far easier to assign them roles of gossip, romance, scandal, or obscurity, effectively airbrushing their more substantive contributions from the public record. Political propaganda also played a role. The new Hanoverian dynasty, having replaced a century of Stuart rule, was hypersensitive to public impression. From the outset they needed to project stability, legitimacy, and Protestant virtue. Queens, barraged by rumors whether about intelligence, ancestry, mental health, or fidelity, could be perceived as liabilities. A frightened court often found it convenient to hush these figures sooner than highlight them. So, scandal became a tool not just for sensationalism but for control, to marginalize outspoken women, replace them with compliant actors, or redirect public attention to more palatable narratives favoring the crown and its male representatives. Even cultural memory with its statues and ceremonial legends reflected this erasure. Men like Walpole, Pitt, or Wellington were lionized in public monuments, while queens were granted busts at best usually tucked away in corridors or secondary niches. Museums, when they depicted royal women, did so through sentimental portraiture emphasizing maternal virtue or religious devotion. The nuances of their political insight, their contributions to intellectual life, their resistance to unfair constraints, were consistently deemed unfit for the national story. Despite these omissions, the voices of the forgotten began to emerge in the late 20th century. Feminist historiography challenging both methodology and content reopened questions long dismissed. Scholars began asking, what did these women think? What influence did they wield in private? How did their roles as mothers, patrons, intellectual interlocutors, and advisors shape public affairs? Archival excavation revealed correspondence with ministers, involvement in educational initiatives, patronage of dissenting theologians, and strategic use of court networks. In these documents, queens appeared as active participants in the governance of people and ideas. At the same time, media portrayals began to shift. Novels, television series, and biographies started to dramatize the lives of women like Caroline of Brunswick, Sophia Dorothea, and Queen Charlotte not as villains or victims, but as multifaceted human beings navigating a male-dominated, press-driven world. Shows like Queen Charlotte, a Bridgerton story, began to recast consorts within a broader cultural imagination, drawing attention to understudied details, especially when these stories resonated with modern concerns around race, gender, and agency. Museums also joined this movement. Curators began to display personal letters, drawings, and objects of royal women as more than vestigial curios. Exhibits focused on the intellectual circles Caroline of Ansbach convened, the botanical initiatives of Charlotte, or even the clandestine cultural salons hosted by Augusta. These exhibits challenged sanitized, official narratives and invited viewers to consider royal women as dynamic participants in their historical moment. Such rediscovery has implications far beyond nostalgia or rehabilitation. Rewriting the royal canon matters because it reflects how societies conceptualize power, identity, and historical agency. Inclusive royal histories dismantle the notion that monarchy was or is purely masculine, hereditary, and formal. They reveal how women shaped dynastic careers, influenced decision-making behind closed doors, and served as moral compasses in moments of crisis. They append assumptions of female passivity and reframe queens as figures whose relationships, intelligence and actions added nuance to national stories. In the context of modern monarchy, remembering these queens is more than a matter of equity, it is a way of casting contemporary royalty within a framework of moral agency, flexibility, and resilience. As modern monarchies wrestle with debates around relevance, constitutional reform, and national identity, the stories of queens who shaped, tolerated, or mediated during dynastic crises offer lessons in soft power. Their lives remind us that moral authority, public presence, and quiet strength can stand beside or even offset formal rule. Moreover, inclusive histories help dismantle lingering myths, that monarchical power has always been unified or that royal women were always powerless. Instead, we see complexity, moral constraint, struggle for influence, public expectation, and personal suffering all filtered through gendered standards. These stories allow us to better understand the modern royal institution's relationship to media, public sentiment, and cultural memory. Recovering the stories of these women is not merely about representation, it is a corrective of historical texture. It allows us to see how dynasties are built and sustained through networks of female virtue, patronage, motherhood, and diplomatic labor, how institutional narratives operate to center certain voices and marginalize others, and how 60 years after William IV, the monarchy entered a Victorian age shaped as much by women as by men. In rewriting these stories, historians, educators, curators, and storytellers can demonstrate that monarchy and by extension, history was never as male as we once believed. In remembering Sophia Dorothea, Caroline of Ansbach, Augusta, Charlotte, Caroline of Brunswick, and Adelaide, we reclaim parts of our collective memory. Women who bore crown and scandal, influence and restraint, visibility and erasure only to have history forget them by design. Reframing their legacies enriches not just our understanding of monarchy, but our sense of what constitutes shared history, moral leadership, and national character. Over the course of more than a century of Hanoverian rule, the women who stood beside the kings of Great Britain left behind a complicated tapestry of suffering, strength, subtle influence, and social invisibility. In examining their lives, a compelling pattern emerges, one of royal women who were never meant to be entirely seen, let alone understood. They were at once the companions of power and its most delicate victims. To remember these consorts is not simply to reclaim their personal stories, but to expand our comprehension of monarchy, politics, and gender in early modern Britain. From Sophia Dorothea of Celle, whose fate was sealed behind the walls of Alden House, to Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, whose soft-spoken presence marked the close of the Hanoverian line, these women traversed lives shadowed by political necessity, personal grief, and historical neglect. Their narratives were punctuated by scandal, exile, loss, and loneliness, but also by resilience, cultural engagement, and moments of influence that unfolded quietly behind court walls. Sophia Dorothea, married off to George Louis, later George I, was a woman stripped of agency and silence for the rest of her life. Her imprisonment for alleged infidelity wasn't just a punishment for supposed indiscretion. It was a political maneuver to preserve dynastic integrity at the cost of personal liberty. For 32 years she endured enforced solitude, becoming a spectral figure of sorrow and injustice in royal history. Her story exemplifies the most brutal extremes of royal marriage as a tool of statecraft. Caroline of Ansbach, in sharp contrast, wielded remarkable influence as the wife of George II. Far from a passive ornament of court, she engaged deeply in theological debate, supported early Enlightenment thinkers, and managed the king's moods and decisions with finesse. Working in collaboration with Robert Walpole, she exercised behind-the-scenes power that subtly shaped Britain's political landscape. Yet even she, despite all her intellectual accomplishments and public favor, has often been relegated in history to the roles of patient wife and stoic mother. Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, the wife of the ill-fated Frederick, Prince of Wales, occupied a more liminal position. Young and foreign, she arrived in Britain under immense pressure and with few allies. Widowed early, she raised the future George III largely on her own, instilling in him the moral and ideological framework that would define his reign. Though often viewed as rigid or aloof, Augusta was a shrewd matriarch whose influence helped stabilize the dynasty during a precarious transition. Her legacy, however, has been frequently misunderstood, cast through lenses of xenophobia and court gossip. Queen Charlotte, consort of George III, was perhaps the most enduring figure in the Hanoverian lineage. Her long marriage produced 15 children, many of whom occupied central roles in shaping the next century of monarchy. She managed the household with austerity and care, stood by her husband through periods of profound mental illness, and remained a cultural patron of science, music, and botany. In recent years, attention to her possible African ancestry has revived interest in her image, prompting both celebration and controversy. Charlotte's story serves as a case study in how modern reinterpretation can reclaim a forgotten legacy and challenge conventional narratives about race, femininity, and monarchy. Caroline of Brunswick's tumultuous relationship with George IV became a public spectacle. The separation, mutual accusations of infidelity, and her sensational attempt to attend the king's coronation made her a symbol of defiance against royal hypocrisy. Popular opinion embraced her not necessarily for who she was, but for what she represented, a woman wronged by power. She exposed the monarchy's vulnerabilities to the press and public protest, making her story not only one of personal pain, but of shifting political consciousness. Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen exemplified dignity and endurance in a quieter register. Her marriage to William IV was more stable than many of her predecessors, and her role in calming his volatile impulses contributed to a more measured kingship. Adelaide suffered multiple personal losses, including the deaths of her children, yet continued to serve with discretion and religious devotion. She saw the monarchy pass into a new era with the accession of Queen Victoria, leaving behind a legacy of restraint, service, and humility. These 6 women, spanning over a century of British monarchy, shared no singular fate or character. Yet common threads run through their stories: tragedy and tenacity, invisibility and influence. They remind us that the stage of monarchy is not only set by kings, parliaments, and wars, but also by bedrooms, court salons, nurseries, and private letters. The human cost of dynastic politics, particularly for women born or married into the institution, was profound. These consorts bore the burden of ceremonial expectation, personal sacrifice, and political expedience. Their happiness was never the priority, their obedience was. To understand their lives is to confront the limitations placed on women, not only within royal families but in broader historical frameworks. For centuries, history books, biographies, and classrooms focused on men as decision-makers and agents of change. Royal women were relegated to the background, their significance filtered through the reputations of their husbands and sons. When they failed to conform, when they loved unwisely, spoke too freely, or grieved too openly, they were pathologized or dismissed. What makes their rediscovery so vital is the way it forces a re-evaluation of the structures of memory. Who gets remembered and why? Whose lives are allowed complexity? These questions are not simply academic. They influence how society assigns value, power, and humanity across gender lines. The resurgence of interest in these women, thanks in part to feminist scholarship, popular media, and museum reinterpretations, shows that audiences are hungry for richer, more inclusive narrative stories that explore not just the triumphs of kings but the endurance of queens. Public history plays a crucial role in this reclamation. When museums highlight personal artifacts, when documentaries showcase newly uncovered letters, when dramatizations treat consorts as full individuals rather than stereotypes, they give the public tools to think differently about the past. Education too must play its part. If school curricula continue to teach monarchy as a procession of kings and battles, we lose not only half the cast, but the subtler dynamics of power and identity that make history truly compelling. Tribute is also key. Statues, plaques, and public acknowledgments should not only honor military victories or political offices, but also the human stories that defined an age. Recognizing these women publicly through restored buildings, dedicated spaces in historical exhibitions, or new biographies signals a broader cultural shift toward justice in memory. Yet this work is not complete. Each generation must continue to re-examine the past with fresh questions and new methods. The archive is not neutral. What is preserved, what is omitted, and what is emphasized reflect choices often political, often gendered. Rereading those records with a critical eye opens the door to stories once thought lost. As we close the story of the Hanoverian consorts, what remains is not simply a list of forgotten names but a set of vivid lives, women who lived at the heart of empire, shaped the next generation of rulers, and navigated the collision between personal emotion and public expectation. Some, like Caroline of Ansbach and Queen Charlotte, worked within the system to exercise influence. Others, like Sophia Dorothea and Caroline of Brunswick, were cast aside but refused to disappear. Still others, like Augusta and Adelaide, left a quieter but no less meaningful imprint. To remember them is not only to do justice to the past. It is to enrich the way we understand the present. Their experiences echo in modern debates about women's agency, public roles, and historical recognition. They remind us that power comes in many forms, that silence can be a choice or a sentence, and that legacy is something to be earned, contested, and shared. These queens, once forgotten, deserve their place not just in footnotes or portraits, but in the center of our collective historical imagination.